All right, and we are live. Thank you, Nate, so much for joining me. Hello, everyone out there in the data space. Welcome to a chat about analytics management for teams. Do you have anything you want to say, Nate, as kind of an intro?
Yeah, happy to. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. So, I'm Nate. I come. It's funny. You're the Seattle data guy. I come from Seattle, a little bit north of it. So I happen to still be in the Seattle area. So yeah, this is where I grew up little north of Seattle, and I've kind of hung out up here. So I'm here. Have a couple little kids. If you hear some noises in the background, you'll hear the little ones. They're both unfortunately sick. Got about I don't know 3 hours of sleep last night, the night before. So running on that parent kind of energy you try to pick up for the evening. So yeah, I'm excited to be here. I've been doing data for 8 years or so. Happy to share my story and hopefully answer some questions, and happy to be part of the discourse.
Perfect. Yeah, so just because you brought up North Seattle, like which part of North Seattle, like Shoreline or?
I'm in Everett, so I'm in North Everett. Yeah.
Okay, north.
Real, it is
in the great north. No, I'm kidding.
I was a little bit north of Seattle until COVID happened, and work from home seemed to be a thing. And so my wife and I, with the little ones, we decided to move. We actually moved about 2 weeks before she was due with our second one. So we were moving, and also, I mean, it was a crazy few weeks, but worked out. So yeah, we moved north for a little bit of a yard and things like that we could have for the kids. So worked out well. Now I'm at a remote job, so
nice.
The gamble paid off.
Yeah, actually, that suddenly makes sense in terms of why you worked at Funco, because Funco is right up there, isn't it?
Yeah, we're actually living in Everett. We've had 2 different stints up here, so I was up in Everett when I was at Funco. Yeah, exactly. So that was like a 10-minute drive. It wasn't too bad to be up there.
Yes, yeah. I mean, not to get too off track from questions, but I just remember because I think at one point was investing in and out of Funco just because they kind of were smallish stocks. They go up and down. So I saw it. I was like, oh, I know Funco, and obviously I think most people have some Funco. Actually, I have a Funco pop over there. I think most people in tech have some sort of Funco pop. So
yeah, I have this is a funny story. So at Funco was pretty small when I was there, and one day Stan Lee from Marvel Comics stopped by the warehouse in the office, and I remember you get free or cheap Funko Pops from the company store there on site, and someone grabbed a Batman and was going to have Stan Lee sign the Batman. And I remember saying, you need to go and find something Marvel, like anything. Because I was like, let me help you out. I don't think anyone really knew who Stan Lee was, but it was pretty funny. So that was that happened sometimes when people would get in, and I learned a lot about pop culture there. It wasn't really something I knew about a lot before.
Yeah, that'd be really awkward if you went to Stan Lee and like, hey, can you sign this like Superman or Batman Funko Pop? And he just look at you like, he's like, do you know who I am or do you not?
I almost should have let it happen. Honestly, that would have been even fun. Probably even a better story. Just let it happen. But yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, usually when I do these kind of questions, the first one I like to ask is, what do you do when you're not working in the data field?
Yeah, I'm sure as many of you who are parents can guess, a lot of my time is with the little ones. So they're 4 and 1, so no school time yet. Really, they're at home for the most part. So a lot of kid time. My wife has her own small business actually. So once I finish work, I take over, and she goes and is able to work on her business. So a lot of my time is spent with the little ones. But when it's not little ones or work, which are the 2 main buckets, do a lot of golfing in the weekends with my dad and friends. That's when just to get me out. It's like very different from working on a computer. If it wasn't golf, it'd be something outdoors here in Seattle, hiking or something like that. Besides that, a lot of time with board games with friends. We'll try to make that happen. Not as much with the kids, but we did for a while. Or now it's turned into video games. We had a group of friends of mine who were all dads. We get together and try to do some stuff. So we did some video games. So I don't know, some other stuff to fill the time, but it's mostly kids and work is the primary part right now, with a little bit of golf.
Yeah, that at least you're getting some time away, so that's good. I guess then how did you get into data?
Yeah, it's a winding road. I actually want to emphasize how winding it was for those looking to get into the career. I know that I try to stay pretty active, talking with people who are trying to get into data. And a lot think it's grab a degree, hop into data. That wasn't the case for me. I don't think it was the case for the majority of data workers. So I actually, in college, I studied international economic development. I got an economics degree, and I actually studied abroad in a couple different Spanish-speaking countries. Was going to go work in economic development. So countries that needed, boost economically, whatever it was. Did an internship in the Dominican Republic. My wife and I, as we were getting married just out of college, we were fundraising to go live in Bolivia, like all this stuff. Like we were really getting ready to like go like live abroad, work in this economic development kind of space, NGO space. And I remember that fell apart. Kind of long story short, that door closed on us. And I remember I was at just a tech job doing customer support, answering just Zendesk tickets coming in for a language learning website, funny enough, called Live Mocha, which is up here in Seattle. And I had to figure out what to do with my career at that point. So I just took a customer support job just to enable myself after 5 p.m. to go on and fundraise and go travel abroad. So I spent 3 years or so, didn't really know where to go. I did customer success work, working with sales a lot. So I have a background in customer success sales, which that'll tie into some stories as we get later into my data career. And I remember, so eventually the company I was working for was a startup, ran out of money. Rosetta Stone bought us. If you remember, like the yellow boxes, CDs sold in airports, all that kind of thing. They bought us as they were trying to transition out of CD-ROMs. So I was working as a CS rep and learned about this data thing. Like I met someone doing sales analytics. Someone at the company I was at was doing the product analytics for Live Mocha. So I saw them doing that, and I realized when I look back, I was naturally doing data. In that very first job I described where I was answering emails, we would change something on the website, and we'd get 1,000 emails back about like what, people not liking the change or liking it, feedback about it, whatever it was. And I remember putting together reports. It turns out retrospectively, I'd go into Zendesk and tag the tickets and say, 30% of people thought this, just very descriptive, kind of simple addition, but I would get that out to the product team so they could have real-time feedback on like how were their changes being impacted. And took over, as I look back again, Salesforce reports, was working on those for CS teams and things like that. So I met Rosetta and I go, I like the data thing. These people are doing it. And this is kind of that, I call it the great filter. Like it's hard to get to that first data job. And so I was sitting in that, 4 years into my career. And this is where Funko steps in. So from Twitter, in case any of you follow him, Jacob Mattson, I know him from childhood. Our parents were friends. So he worked at Funko at the time. And he said, for a while I was bouncing and saying, I'm looking for a data job. Let me know if something happens there. I was talking to other people in other companies, Zillow, I remember talking to, Tableau, others. Couldn't break into it. And one day he said, hey, they might be thinking about a data person. Do you want to come in for an interview? And so that was my chance to go and see if I could find a kind of even like a part-time data role. So ended up at Funko actually doing half-time data and half-time this other role that they needed someone just to cover. So I could do something right away that provided value that no one else really wanted to do. And then they said, with the other half of your time, see if you could figure out the data stuff. Like I didn't know SQL, had never touched a database. I read a book about databases. I read a book about SQL, but I hadn't actually used it. So that was my foot in the door, kind of meandering from international development all the way up to doing sales work and then trying to get myself into data, eventually landing it at Funko.
Nice. Yeah. I think it's always interesting, like where opportunities kind of come in. I think some people, we assume like, oh, I'll just become whatever it is, a data engineer, an analytics engineer, data scientist out of day one. And for some people, I feel like I've always talked to them and it's always an interesting path, right? Like it's for some people straightforward. For some people, it's like, hey, a door opened and I took it. I learned SQL. I always think back to my friend who started at Amazon and like she was a financial analyst and like day one, like her manager like handed her a SQL book and was like, learn this. It's just like, here, this is your new world. And so I think that's for a lot of people, that's it's like, if you're lucky, you get the right opportunity and you kind of push in from there.
Yeah, I would talk to I took a few people out to coffee when I was at Rosetta Stone saying like, how did you get into data? Like I found people on LinkedIn or wherever through my network. And all of them were just like, I just ended up here. Like, just happened. So yeah, it wasn't very clear how to get into it. So I had to be intentional about trying to poke opportunities and eventually get. Yeah, it's usually meandering for many of us.
Yeah. Well, now that I think you've kind of gone beyond, right? Like just doing analytical work. I mean, I'm sure you still do plenty in your day-to-day job, but you've kind of switched over, I think, to more managing data analytics, some analytics engineering teams. I'd love to kind of know what advice you have for people as they're kind of getting started in that role.
Yeah, and I'll give some kind of context on it as I'm a newish manager. So I've I did analytics after Funko for I'm at year 8 now, so I've done quite a bit of analytics, mostly as a data analyst, analytics engineering kind of work. But 2 years ago or so, I got an opportunity to lead a team for the first time. So I, wish I had some of this advice as I was hopping into that role. I did have, some folks who were really gave me a lot of thoughts as I was overwhelmed and learning how to what does it mean to manage. So I had a team at Smartsheet, which was my last company. I was there for just about 5 years. I was given a team of 2 analytics engineers and a task to go build the data source of truth. We have a lot of data in Snowflake and it's disorganized. Go make it make sense and help the business build things on top of that, whether it be the application itself, all the way down to just the newest sales rep coming in. How do they get the data they need that's consistent? So I hopped into that role, not fully knowing what I was doing yet. It was pretty brand new, but willing to take on the challenge. So the biggest piece of advice that at least I learned there, and I'm sure with time I'll have other ones that bubble up, but the biggest one is I learned how to make the work of my team visible to people who were the layer above me and even the layer above me for that. So my manager was a VP of analytics, the head of all the kind of the data science, data engineering, BI world. And then his manager was the COO. So my skip was in the C-suite. So as we were working on this, it's really technical work, like figuring out Snowflake and we were setting up DBT for the first time. We were doing all sorts of work, doing back-end technical pieces, but we needed to make sure the work was visible. Otherwise people wondering what are those guys up to? I started in February of last year with this team, and we didn't get our database out until December. So it took us about 10 months or so it was just a lot of work unwinding and designing and figuring out what we were doing. I had a baby, so there's some paternity leave time there too, which made it go a little longer. But the biggest piece, and this is the feedback I got as I left, was that I was able to make sure the work we were doing was not only visible, but that it connected to the important parts of the business. That the COO that I would, as I talk with him once a month and send out weekly emails about what are we working on and why is it important, I made sure people were in the know, as well as other departments, kind of what are we doing and why would it benefit you? So a lot of it was making the work visible as my biggest piece of advice. It's easy to hop into a rabbit hole and work on things, but if your work isn't visible, then people won't connect to you internally to give you other opportunities to have your work impact them. And just generally, I think you'll feel kind of isolated. So that's the biggest piece of advice.
Yeah, I think I'd like to dig into kind of how do you help people make their work visible? Because I think that's definitely something that when you're on the tech side or when you're thinking more purely on the data side, you may not always connect with, because you're just I need to figure out how to write a better query or whatever, how to write a better model, and you don't necessarily think about how do I now talk to the business and make this valuable to them. So what advice, I guess, do you have kind of in that vein?
Yeah, so for me, it was always focusing on what's going to make some people's lives easier and then beat that drum, right? So for our project impacted multiple people. An example of it is the analysts, and I had a counterpart who managed the data science and data analyst team. They had all sorts of qualms with how they got their data and how hard it was for them to put models into production and all sorts of things. So we made sure that as we were working on the project, we were bringing them into the discussion saying, hey, we're building this. Let's make sure this is the process you'd want. And we think this will make your life easier. Let's get your feedback on it. So we'd make sure they were up to date and just in the know once a week of what have we rolled out? What's the next thing we're doing? What's our timeline for when you'll get it? So making sure that it was focused on what was valuable for them. We cut things. If it was a neat technical problem and theoretically solve something, if it didn't actually have something that we could point to and say, this will solve this pain point in the business, then we would put that lower on the priority list and still be there. We put it lower. So focusing on what alleviates folks' problems was a big piece of that, because then we can make it visible by talking about it with them. And then at the higher levels, with my manager and others, it was really laying out, for me at least, a roadmap of what are we doing and how does this connect to what you need? In that case, self-serve analytics was a big deal. That was actually the thing that it wasn't clear at first, but it became clear that was going to be the focus of what we were working on as a data team. So then it became plugging in our work and how it will enable self-service. And it was pretty easy to draw the line there, right? You build a source of truth database with kind of the data people need, and then you can build self-service on top of that, whatever that might look like. It'll look different for finance or product or sales or marketing. but you can build it. So drawing that line and saying what we're building is connecting to this larger goal, I think that helped make it visible, beyond just the weekly updates and things.
Yeah. I do think like the weekly updates probably do help. I think sometimes some teams stray away from like being like, hey, here's where we're at, here's what's blocking us, here's where we're going. I just thinking back to Facebook days, you did that more like there because there was 1,000 other data engineers, and it's like, okay, how do I make my work important when there's 1,000 more of us that could easily do my job? So it's always about kind of tooting your own horn and being like, hey, look, this is something that I'm doing. This is why I think it's important. So for anyone out there who's like at any level, whether you're a manager, whether you're just getting started, I think it's always important to look for opportunities to share your work and be like, look, this is important, this is why, and this is where it's attached to. So no, I really like that. So when you start kind of leading a data team, like do you have like some 30, 60, 90-day goals that you try to get out?
Yeah, so this is when I read that, it's such a good question. I'm at day just about 30 right now. I think I'm like day 28 of my new job. So it's something that's been on my mind. I actually, did a presentation with my manager, who's the head of sales, actually at Insightly, where I work now, going over like, here's the last 30 days, and here's what I think the next 30 look like. So it's been on my mind. It's great timing. There's a great few blog posts from Pedram Navid, if anyone follows him on Twitter, about I think that was the first 8 weeks or so, I think 60 days in that case. So it's funny, I was reading through that and making sure that I was hitting some of those points. Some of them were really, really good for someone like me. And this is the first time like I'm stepping into a role for context. I think this would help. There's no other data person where I just moved to. So I'm going from a team of like, I don't know, there was 25, 30 data people, from data engineers, BI, data science, plus other teams, like the total amount of like probably 50 data workers at Smartsheet in various places, to I'm the only one at a place. So this is and I'm expected to then come up with this plan of like, what does the team look like? How do you build it? Like, who do we hire? What tools do we use? Like, that's all like this greenfield. I have to figure it out. So it's a new role. So this is me trying it out, and I'll be so I'm excited to share as I figure out what works and what didn't. I'm very curious to see what it is. But for now, the first 30 days, which I just completed, for me are really context gathering. That's where I need to go and say like, who is who and what data do we have and what problems are people running into and what things don't, like just gathering context. So I just meeting after meeting after meeting. It's harder remote, frankly. This is like to be a tangent, but it's harder to do this remote than it was when I was in person in offices. So context gathering is number one for the first 30 days or so. 30 to 60, the plan for the next month is starting to prove some value, really like build out some of the basics, like get some of the basic infrastructure. And for me, it's like, I need some DBT running. We have Snowflake already, so I can like just plug it into some Snowflake models and get some like proofs of concept and some initial questions answered as I organize some of the data. So it's, initial organization, tech stack, and also starting to prove some value. So that, at least at this organization, they haven't seen data done really well. So I want to make that happen. So that's my focus to start showing some glimpses of that in the next 30 days. The 60 to 90 bit of it is really, I think that at that point, having the strategy of like, what is this data team and how does it fit into this context and the needs of the business? So gather the context, figure out the needs and where the data is at, and then say, what team do we need or what structure do we need to support that going forward? And how does the data team fit into the sales org where I work now? With marketing, with product, with finance, there's all sorts of different teams. So it's more the strategy of how does it plug into the org, and then what is the team like? How should it look based on those needs? So not there yet, because I'm only at day 28 or so now. But that's really where I'm aiming to go, at least by day 90.
Yeah, I think that sounds reasonable. I think especially like in the first 30, even like when I do like consulting projects, it's like most of that is like you're really gaining a ton of context. Maybe you're making some recommendations, but early on it's hard to even do that because it's like you just got to understand the business. You got to understand, what's there technically, how everything operates. And then there's a lot of other like contextual questions that you just have to kind of gain information on. What does everyone care about? That's always kind of important, right? Like before diving in and being like, let's invest $20,000 in some new, infrastructure component, or let's invest, hiring a new person. If you don't know what you're doing, it's hard to make those calls.
Yeah, very, very difficult. So yeah, that's where I've been, even today I was spending hours, digging through different tables, trying to make numbers match, like how do I like count this? How do I count that? Asking questions in Slack. So yeah, that's just kind of, I think, how it is at first, right? You're just trying to I'm going, it's quite jarring. I'm sure people who've moved jobs know this, but I went from someone at Smartsheet for 5 years where I was the expert. Like I built the source of truth database, like the team I managed built it, but like I had built a lot of stuff in the past. Like I worked with, like I knew the context of the business. So to go from being the one everyone went to gain context to like having none is jarring. So it's getting used to that, I think, was a big piece of the first 30 days, is being okay with all of a sudden not being fast at answering all the questions. That's something I'd gotten used to, I think, at the last role.
Yeah. When you're like the master of the universe, it is much easier when someone like asks you a question, you'd be like, oh, yes. And then now it's like, are you dealing with like, is it a completely new system? Like in terms of like, have they already built something? Or is it just, you're now building it, so you're kind of just pulling data from their table, so you're just having to figure out the actual application tables before going forward?
It's more the latter. There's one person who's moonlighted a bit, who stood up Snowflake and some data pipelines into it. So they've stood up some of it, but it's not really, there's, I don't know, a few dozen tables as opposed to Smartsheet where I was unwinding, 1,500 tables, something like that were updated nightly. So there's a few dozen kind of small tables that are great templates that just need some, TLC, getting them modeled, into some DBT models that are easy to maintain, pieces like that. So for the most part, though, it's building it kind of brand new and going into the raw data and figuring out where things are.
Yeah. That's it's always exciting though to move to start on greenfields. I guess you're. Sorry. I was gonna say, since you kind of like just probably picking maybe new tools to pick or to use. How do you recommend people kind of find the right tools for their team as they're kind of going forward to build kind of new infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a good question. We had to go through this at Smartsheet when we were building out, like, how do we set up our source of truth database? So that was a piece of it that we had to go through. I think the biggest part. So I'm a pragmatic person. I'm a team of one at the moment until I have a bigger team at Insightly. But a lot of it, my advice is to be pragmatic. Like whatever someone has going, like try to step into that, because it's like less of you having to stand up things, and you can get to value a little faster. So an example is like they had Snowflake at Smartsheet. They happen to have Snowflake at Insightly, which is nice. So I kind of know the database. But even if they were running on something else, I wouldn't go rip and replace and say, we're going to go with a new data warehouse, because it's like BigQuery or Postgres or anything, really anything. It wouldn't really matter that much. I think that's the big piece of advice, is at least for me, is I don't want to go in and rip and replace. I'll go figure out whatever the tool is, because I kind of find a lot of them interchangeable. That makes sense. Like a BI tool, like if you have Tableau, great. Power BI, awesome. Mode, cool. Like whatever it is, Domo, like if you have it, we can probably figure it out. There's really no need. There's not a lot of value to go and rip and replace things that are there. So that's the biggest piece of advice I think I have, is that you don't need to reshape the world. It's go and figure out how to count some stuff. Your database is the bigger piece of it. The one tool I do have an opinion on is after seeing the value of DBT, where I didn't have the value of it before. Like at Smartsheet, we had hundreds of tables. I think it was between 1,200 and 1,500, depending on how you counted. Tables refreshing nightly in Airflow, like running scripts. Nothing really organizing it. Like the DAG was like manually created. So after seeing the power that had to unlock what we built over the last year and a half, that's one that I am opinionated on, is have something like that. Maybe there's some other option that if you're familiar with it, then go with it. But that's the one that I'm at least opinionated on, is that really unlocked myself and the other data analysts and data scientists to get our data done. So that's the one that I have it installed on my local machine, getting things up and running, so I can at least run some tables. But really choosing tech is roll with what folks have, at least at first. And, maybe I'm probably not opinionated enough or have enough conviction to come in and totally overhaul a tech system. But besides that, go with what you're familiar with is usually a big piece of it. Like usually, the piece that you've run before, you don't really need to like learn a new tool. Like use what especially if it's infrastructure pieces. Like those are parts that typically aren't value add. Like they're kind of replaceable depending on the tool. So all that answer probably sounds like non-committal, but I really don't come in saying, hey, go and figure out your tech stack with, I don't know, these particular parameters. Go in with what's familiar and what's already there and try to build inside of that. It's usually my initial attitude.
Yeah, I think it's tempting to sometimes like completely rip and replace, because it's like, well, I'm going to either know the solution better, or, maybe it'll be faster for you something else, or it's just like cool thing to use currently. But it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to like rip and replace, especially if you're the only person. So oftentimes, you know, you put I assume you put a lot of risk on yourself, especially as like a manager, or someone who's especially supposed to be leading this team. You know, if you're going to be taking 3 months just to rip and replace, you know, someone eventually starts asking questions like, so what are you actually doing? Right, you're not delivering anything. So, you know, anything that kind of reduces that or increases that time to value can often, you know, not be beneficial. Maybe at some point when your infrastructure is in better shape, you can think about replacing things that need to be replaced. Do you have any? I'm curious. Do you have any opinions in terms of like observability or catalogs?
So I don't actually, not a ton of opinion on that. We use DBT documentation for a lot of our kind of cataloging, at least at Smartsheet, which was fine. People would still ask in Slack, even if you like had the perfect documentation, you still get questions elsewhere. But nothing big on the observability piece. At least we hadn't gotten to that stage yet. I'm sure if I was there for another year or two as we developed it, I'd have an opinion. But at least as of now, I don't.
Yeah, I'm always curious because, like, ingestion, storage, transformation, BI, those are kind of unavoidable layers if you're building any form of data stack, so to speak. But though, catalogs, observability are just unavoidably next. But it's like this meta layer where people are like, well, do we need it yet? Do we not need it? Can we just write some SQL queries to do some quick data quality checks, and that will be sufficient for now? I do imagine with 1,500 tables, it would be nice to have some sort of something. So did you guys have anything in place? More just curious.
No, so the tables more or less would run, and then the only errors that would come out is if a table failed to run. Was more or less what it was. Like out of Airflow. Airflow was orchestrating a lot of it. So what we did was, at least with DBT, we did set up tests. This is one thing we were able to do with our new databases because we were migrating stuff over to it. Much tighter set of tables too, because a lot of those were duplicative and things like that. But that's where we could have, tests saying like, does this table make sense? Does this column make sense, especially for key ones? A big one is the raw data fresh was a big deal for us. We didn't want to update our tables, especially incremental models that needed, it needed the freshest data. And if it ran, you have to go back and correct the previous runs, things like that. So for us, a lot of it was like data freshness was a big deal. And then there's a few other pieces, but we did that through DBT tests actually on our tables.
Yeah, I was gonna say I think DBTS has something like that. I've been recently kind of poking around with elementary data, which is just a open source insert into DBT package, which is really nice. There's a lot of easy ways you can do that without even purchasing a solution. Which may or may not make people happy, but I'm always curious there. So we've kind of talked a little bit about technology. One thing I'm always curious is like the processes people put into place. So I'm curious, like, are there certain processes you like to put into place as you're kind of managing a team to improve workflows? How do you kind of set that portion up?
Yeah, I'll at least give the processes that worked well on the team at Smartsheet as I was going, and I'll probably implement some of these again once I get a team rolling at Insightly. So it's remote, right? And the hours are kind of, you work to get your work done. So we are all kind of working. It feels kind of isolating, and you want to make sure that there's accountability among the team. Like, are we working on the right things? Are we spending time on the right things? That kind of stuff. So one piece that I implemented that I really liked in Slack was when the week started on Monday, a Slack bot would post saying, what are your priorities for the week? What are you planning on getting done? Just some kind of summary, what's the plan for the week? And that was really helpful. So the team could see that. And eventually we added, beyond just the 2 team members, we had a couple contractors working with us. And then we had a team member working in India. So we had time zones all over the place and people living all over the place. So we had this message where people would say what their goals were, and that would spur a lot of discussion. I didn't actually think it would do that at first. I was using it more just as a way, because here's what it is, and we could be on the same page. But people would discuss, wait a minute, you're doing that? I have this thing I did. It spurred and made sure things were kind of cross-functional between everyone, which is great. So some Slack messages like that, and then one would kick off every day at the end of the day. So this is instead of doing a stand-up, because time zones, it's impossible, and also I'd much rather this be in Slack than an actual meeting where everyone has to get onto their cameras. Would say, what did you ship today? I think was the question that would post. What's the thing you shipped? Did you ship a merge request? Did you get alignment with one of our stakeholders on the answer to one of your questions? What was it that you accomplished today? And that kind of number one, it gave you a nudge, like you wanted to have, something to show at the end of the day. So like, here's what I did. But also, again, that kept us all in tune with what was happening. So I think that workflow is like a remote team worked really well. It allowed us to know what we were all doing, and it made it so we didn't feel like we were drowning in kind of pointless meetings. Like it was all, let us work at our own pace and answer the question as we finished our day.
Yeah. That is reminding me of the Silicon Valley scene where Jared introduces Scrum and they're like, we're not going to be tricked by this like MBA level, BS. And then suddenly they're like tricked by this MBA level BS. We're like, oh man, you want to get tasks done. And I do think like I do that with like putting meetings on my schedule, which is like, let's meet on whatever Tuesday and let's review, because like that's just one way to like make sure you're getting something done, right? Because it's like, like you said, you don't want to end up at that meeting and be like, what'd you do? You're like, nothing. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Come to that meeting or come to that check-in with, that you finish. Otherwise, you feel bad. So it does work.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. So we had originally that I was mentioning that weekly email I'd update like the various stakeholders with what we completed. That was going out on Fridays at like 2:00, I think is when I'd send it. And we figured out that we had some like breaking, like people would want to get stuff in for that email because it went out and everyone knew it was read. And so the feedback was, can we have that not be Friday? Because we're shipping stuff like 2 p.m. on Friday that's breaking production at like the 4:00 run. So we had to move that email to Tuesday. So yeah, exactly. It's funny. Those gates are really kind of motivating. So this is one of the kind of the lessons learned from starting to manage a team. But that was a funny one. We had to move the weekly check-in email to not a Friday afternoon, so we didn't have to work on Saturday morning cleaning up something.
That's funny. I like referencing this, but on at Facebook, if you ever tried to push any code at like 2 p.m. on a Friday, you get a little like red warning with like a cute little fox on it being like, it's 2 p.m. on a Friday. Are you sure you want to deploy this code? And will you be here tomorrow to make sure it's working or not? It's like, oh yeah, it is 2 p.m. on a Friday. I don't want to be here this weekend, so maybe I'll hold off until Monday. So
lesson learned on that one, like in person for us. So that's one workflow. Another one that again was like the weekly emails, and then we had a pretty good, so at Smartsheet, one thing it's pretty good at is as a ticketing system, like have a form, people could answer it. So we had a pretty good way to get feedback from teams, so we could have it be part of our queue. So that's another just kind of workflow piece that worked well, is people wanted to make sure that we, we're hearing them and getting their requests. And so we typically had a queue and we could kind of go through it and figure out what's going on. So that was kind of a key piece of the getting input from teams, but also trying to be pretty literal that not everything would get done. Like it wasn't a promise we'd finish your ticket, but that would give us feedback for what we were building, which is really helpful.
Yeah. It does sound, again, it sounds like you had some good processes you can kind of bring over. Now thinking bigger picture, just because the data space is so massive, do you have any thoughts on where kind of the data world is going in the next 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, I'm no thought leader on Twitter for it, but I do have at least some thoughts on as I talk with people in kind of the data world, and it's always interesting as I go to a new place where no one's been inside of that world. That I always have to remember to translate between like what I see in like data discussions versus companies who haven't been part of it. The big one I think that I do have conviction about is data will slowly become more and more just an expected skill set, like in the domain. Like it won't be its own separate thing, I think, permanently. In the next 5 years, I don't think it's going to be that fast of a change. Maybe some like really, specific companies will be doing it. But certainly I think we'll see that momentum building in the next 5 years of, instead of data being a separate thing on a central team, like that's where I just came from, that world where we're a central team of like, we're data analysts, data scientists, data engineers on our central spot. And I just really feel that really effective analysts are embedded deeply within the business. Like the most effective, like when I was most effective as an analyst, I was sitting in the sales operations department at Smartsheet doing sales analytics work with like sitting on the floor with the sales team, going to the sales happy hours, going to the sales kickoff. Like that was like one of the team. I just was doing the data center stuff. So to be an excellent analyst, I think you have to really know your domain well. And I think that's hard to do from a central team. Some central teams, I think, have figured it out, and the analysts more or less sit with that team. They just kind of report into that central spot, which makes a lot of sense. But I think generally You'll see analysts migrating towards being just embedded with the teams. And then on top of that, I think you'll see data skills permeating into those teams, so they don't need to go through the BI central world to get the question answered. We saw this at Smartsheet, a couple dozen PMs, and there were like, I don't know, 10 or 11 data analysts, data scientists answering questions. So there was not enough throughput, and that was just the PM team, let alone everyone else. So the PMs who were really effective learned SQL, they learned data modeling, and like they made their own stuff, and they were able to go and be data driven without going through a ticketing queue. So I think you'll see folks say, wait, I can shortcut this by just like learning some SQL and like hopping into a database, or maybe just learning if you get a self-serve tool, you can go build your own kind of data viz. But I think you'll see data skills permeate into the business because they don't want to wait in that queue waiting for the BI teams of the world to answer their ticket. So I think you'll see that data skill merge into the business world more and more over time. That's kind of where I certainly have conviction that I think that's where it's going.
Yeah, I think I referenced this earlier with my friend who was a financial analyst at Amazon and had to learn SQL, and that was something I found interesting back then because I was working with some financial analysts at the time, and it was very different, right? For them, it was like, give me an Excel, right? Like you write the SQL, you pull it, and I'll manage it in Excel. And then like she was over here being forced to basically learn SQL because it's like, no, you are going to pull this data. The data engineers are going to like make the data sets. You're going to still do the analytical work because you're, again, like you said, you're embedded in this team. What we're looking for. You can't ask the data engineer to both understand the technical aspect and then like 30 different business aspects and domains and hope that they're going to know the difference between the various KPIs, which are probably all called the same thing for different teams but have slightly different definitions for one reason or another. And yeah, so I do kind of feel like that's kind of getting pushed out more and more as teams kind of need to move faster, so to speak. Are there any terms currently you wish maybe were changed in the data world?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. We hear debates, but I think the way that I would answer the question, there might be terms per se, but I think the way that the titles in the data world are so nebulous, I think that's the biggest thing that I wish would change, frankly. Like different titles mean the same thing and vice versa. Like you don't really know what a title means until you go into the job description and hop into the company, see what it is. So I think that's the biggest kind of term wise that I wish would change. I know there was a talk from Emily Sherrill about Down with Data Science that was at the most recent DBT conference about like the title not making it doesn't differentiate from data analyst enough. Like how do we have two different titles that really kind of mean the same thing, and what does data scientist really mean? It's kind of nebulous. So getting in our data world, defining like what do titles mean? Like what's a BI analyst and a BI engineer and a data analyst and an analytics engineer? Like what is the difference between all these? That's really where I would want terms to mean something specific. Might be me coming from growing up. My dad was a debater and even coached debate for a while at a university. So the definition of words was really hammered into me. Like here's like, you must define what words mean. Like otherwise like, it could be nebulous, confusing discussion. So that's one where I would love clarity around what those different titles are, is where I at least would harp. Yeah.
Do you think it's like, because I feel like that's always been a problem with most titles, right? Like even the term analyst, right, is so nebulous, right? Like you're an operations analyst, you're a data analyst, you're a business analyst. And to some places those mean things, and other places they mean different things. Is this, I'm always curious, is that a fixable thing, or is it just something that's part of, just businesses being businesses, and sometimes they're just going to hire someone because it's like, we need someone that knows SQL and can analyze data. And we've heard that data scientist is kind of like that. Even if data analyst would be sufficient, or product analyst or something like that.
Yeah. I don't see it being fixable, at least not, I don't see where that momentum would come from necessarily. Yeah. The data community itself perhaps could push back on it. But at least I haven't seen where the momentum would come from. Like perfect example of it is I interviewed, this is several years ago, I did an initial interview with Facebook for a data scientist role, like like a recruiter call. I was like, sure, I'll take a call about it. And I listened to it. And I remember at the end of the like spiel of the JD, I said, this is just data analyst work, right? Like this is just adding and subtracting like stuff that I've done now. And I remember the recruiter said, "Oh yeah, we call it data scientist just because that gets us like salary bands we want and it brings candidates in." So she was pretty transparent about the title being used for recruiting purposes, really, right? So I don't really see that changing. There's no like analytics standard that's out there that would force it. So it's my wish that the terms would become more standard. I think that's happening as this is one thing that's changed in the data world since when I started 8 years ago, and now is there wasn't this kind of data community out there where there's tens of thousands of people on the DBT Slack. We have a several thousand person community over at Locally Optimistic. Twitter has a great group of people that are talking about ideas. So there's more cross-pollination now across data teams where we can all get on the same page about like, what are these jobs and what do they mean? So I think that's been immensely valuable, and maybe that's where momentum comes from. That didn't exist. I wish it did 8 years ago when I was learning SQL out of a book and figuring out what SQL Server was. But I think some of that, as our teams talk to each other more, and we're not so siloed as the only data person at a company, perhaps there'll be some momentum there. So maybe that's the hope piece of it. Maybe there will be changes as we all talk to each other.
Yeah, could be. I think a lot of it's driven by the business more than it's driven by the data team. I mean, maybe the data teams get more power, but I think it's generally a business decision. And I think, like, for example, with the Facebook thing, they more moved the positions, right? And I think Zillow did the same thing where they instead of like removing data scientists, they like called them now research scientists. Like what would be traditionally known as like a data scientist position was like, okay, you're a research scientist. You likely have a PhD. You're approaching this work very differently. And working there, some people do more data scientist work as if they're in that title. Some people, more product analyst work where you're doing a lot of like A/B testings and things like that. But also some of that's due to the fact that the tooling is better than most other companies, where it's like, a lot of the hard work that you would do as a data scientist has kind of been removed. Right. So that's one thing. I mean, it's the same thing in the data engineering role at Facebook, and that for some people that was why they'd leave or change to a software engineering position, because they assumed the data engineering role was more of a like data engineer / software engineer role, and they came in, it was closer to like an analytics engineering role where it's like you're doing a lot of SQL and some Python for framing, but that's really the key portion of it. So for some people that didn't always meet what they wanted. So
I've seen that same kind of thing where folks come in and want to work on the software engineering part of it, and it's a lot of SQL or other pieces. Exactly. That's a piece where I've seen some data scientists go from there to machine learning is a whole world that I've started to see live more. At Smartsheet, it was on the engineering team. Like there was a whole MLE team that wasn't part of the data team that were doing in production, like when you're in the actual production Smartsheet app. So, data scientists looking into, do I need to go into software engineering if I want to do that? So you're seeing some of that gradation, I think, of these skill sets are used differently, and you're kind of seeing where those departments live.
Yeah. Well, before going to QA, just Q&A. Do you have any questions for me before we kind of go into that?
I think I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, or if you have any advice for me and others who are changing jobs. Right? You mentioned you've done consulting, right? So do you have any other advice as folks hop in and try to stand up data teams or kind of get their arms around how data works at a company? What are some tips and tricks you've learned about advice I could go and use and others could go and use that are listening? Just getting their arms around data at their new job.
Yeah, I mean, like I think one thing that you covered that I really liked is first just focus on getting context and not to steal what you've already said, but every company, as much as you might be working on similar data sets, the KPIs, all those like various little nuances will kick you or bite you if you don't know what they are. So learning what the company cares about, learning how the data is slightly different, even if you're still pulling it from the same source, and how the KPIs will be measured differently, I think is really important. So getting a good understanding of context is always important. I also think something else that I really like that you referenced is not getting stuck in infrastructure, right? It's really easy to spend months in kind of this infrastructure for infrastructure's sake kind of mentality, where it's just like you're spending 5-6 months of watching different demos from vendors and testing it out and doing a POC and then never really delivering. So that's something that I always like to talk to my clients, like, hey, like let's focus on delivering something And if down the line you need to switch a solution, that's something we can talk about. But more than likely, the baseline tools that exist out there will probably be sufficient for most companies. Facebook, they're using MySQL as their backend for billions of people. So they figured it out. They made it work. So if you think your solution's not, working, maybe look at it and see if there's a reason it's not working, if it's not performing, rather than trying to be like, do we need to switch it out? Because switching out, like you said, is such an expensive and time-consuming endeavor that provides zero generally value until you've finished, and so it's a very big risk for you to take on. Let's see what else. Trying to think. I always try to understand what the business cares about. I think that's something that, like, as technical people, we just like want to move forward with like the technical bit, but taking time to be like, hey, what are the numbers you care about? How do you want to get them? What would actually make you change your decision? I think are very important conversations to have early on, rather than like waiting and building a report and then sending it to someone and them being like, oh, this isn't what I wanted. Because I feel like that's most of us.
Yeah.
Like we build a report and then they're like, oh, this isn't what I wanted. And you're like, okay, this is what you said. What do you mean it's not what you wanted? So, trying to figure out and iterate quickly, I think is important in that space as well. Yeah.
I'm curious as a partial follow-up on this around. So as I come in, I see one of the questions in here is about the tech stack. So it's kind of a decision to make, right? So I'm curious, when do you recommend someone go open source? Like, do you have a heuristic around going open source versus buying a tool? Because I have decisions around, I can get like a Fivetran that brings data into Snowflake, and it's, I can pay for that data coming in, or I can get like a Meltano or something that's an open source one I can install and run. And there's choices like that, like all down the pipe. So I'm curious if you have some thoughts around how those different tools are chosen.
Yeah, generally it's a combination of like who your team is. Like, does your team have the ability to manage an open source solution? Because I don't remember who posted it, but like there's this tweet that went out that open source is free, like a puppy is free, right? Like, it requires management. And if you can manage it, that's fine. But like Airflow, for example, who managed Airflow at Smartsheet?
Our data engineering team, like we had a pretty big team of folks who had years of experience managing that kind of whole flow.
And do you know how they set it up? Was it just Airflow, or did they have it like on Kubernetes? Like, how did they kind of set that all up?
Yeah, they had it on. They had Kubernetes going as well. I think they'd moved to that pretty recently, but they had it running on. Like they had, like Docker images going, different is on AWS, so AWS would, run a lot of it, on different machines there. But yeah, so it was they had a whole kind of structure for it, enough where I'm not technical enough to have known all the different parts of it. We knew enough to edit some scripts so we could run it. But yeah, they had it all running, on this kind of AWS stack. It was very managed. They had to keep track of it. And they had a person, like a QA person, making sure that the different steps were completing, and they had a pager duty if something went wrong. So they had a whole infrastructure set up to make sure things ran on schedule and on time.
So yeah, so that there's where I'm going. No, it's a lot of open source solutions generally require like essentially a person to manage it, right? Maybe it's just one person, but you have like one person who's essentially the data platform engineer. And if you have that person, if you have that skill set, yeah, like there's a lot of benefits, I think, to going open source. But you do have to have that like, skill set in-house. Sometimes you end up paying about the same in both directions, like especially with how expensive some solutions are. But sometimes, solutions can be cheaper. So I think it also depends on like, sometimes you just run into certain mentalities of people where it's like they just love open source, and it's like you're not going to change that mentality. So do you keep them? Like, if you feel like they're a great person to keep on the team, do you keep them and kind of give them what they want, or do you realize like, hey, they're the only person I'm going to get all year. We have actual business value we need to deliver, and I do not want them spending all day, making all these different open source solutions work. So let's just deliver now with, again, a paid solution like Fivetran. And then in the future, if we can hire a new person because we're doing such great work delivering value, we can, pop that solution out and use something different if that really needs to happen. So it's a lot of looking at like what you need now, how quickly you need it. Are you going to have a person that manages basically just your open source solutions? Do they have the right skill set? Things kind of in that space. That's usually what I think about.
Yeah, one of the things I'm hearing you say too is when you can reverse a decision, then it's a little less risky to go and just kind of commit to that, right? Like you're saying, you can go and start bringing data in, and if you need to, then go bring it in house. Like you can end up doing that and kind of change over to that. So it sounds like there's some reversibility as well, which makes I think I'm saying that because someone like me, I like making the right decision. I've always been a pretty precise person. I think a lot of us in data are pretty detail oriented and want to make the right call. So having a decision where, okay, if let's say you want to go away from that, I think in some ways I have an eye towards that is, can I replace this if needed? Like how complex is this getting? When is the point of no return where like replacing like airflow at the last spot, like that would have been just immensely difficult to do, right? Because that was so irreversible. But at some point it wasn't. So I think there's some time where you can test it and kind of see. So that's part of it. But at some point you got to kind of commit and go. And just like right now, as you're saying, at my new place, they're not measuring me based on how nice my data stack is or like how quick my like DAGs run. Like that's not the thing. They're like, can you help us count users and dollars? Like that's like really where it's at, right? So I'll go and get to that point and be figuring out info as I go. But that's helpful to hear kind of your thought on the open source versus buy. There's a couple decision points for me I'm coming to on that at the job.
Yeah, no, it's always an interesting decision, and there are like more managed, like I think there's more and more managed open source solutions, which then it's like, is it really open source anymore? But Airflow, it's like today you could spin that up if you wanted using MWAA, Cloud Composer. Astronomer's a little more technical, but if you needed a really baseline version of Airflow, those could work. They run into limitations eventually, but they'll get you far enough often for most people to like start there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I also like this. I'm going to use open source software as like a puppy is open source. Like next week, have people understand, none of them will be, management. I try to remember whose tweet I saw. I think I remember originally seeing like Sarah Krasnick like reference it, but I don't know. I don't think she was the originator of the tweet. But I remember seeing that. I'm like, yeah, that's a great way of explaining like how free open source often is. I've often found Airflow's not like Airflow's easier, arguably like multiple times easier to manage than like Hadoop was back in the day, but it still has like 5 other things you need to spin up to do it well and scale well. So it's not just like, let me spin up Airflow. The problem is it's deceiving because it's just like, oh, let me just spin up Airflow on your local, desktop. That's it's super easy. But as soon as you start getting complex and having 2,000, DAGs running, things are much more complicated. So,
so connecting into this, by the way, so as I build out, some data pieces, and other teams are doing this, right? They're choosing tools and they're getting them built out. Sometimes it's on their local machine, and it becomes a time to then productionalize this. Like, I need to get this going. I think many times you'll see companies then call in a consultant at that point. It's not really, you don't need like a full-time person to come in and do that full-time, but you do need to make a change, or like say like, how do I structure this in such a way? Do you have any experience helping consult and kind of companies go from these kind of local machine solutions for things and turning it into something that works in a scalable way for them? I'm curious if you have some experience in that.
I think for most of my, like when I've come in for more of like that kind of solutions piece, it's mostly been around like, hey, we already have this application layer. We're kind of doing some analytics. We need to now make that, productionized, but more because they're maybe just pulling data directly from, the source data database like MongoDB or Postgres and just doing, counts on that. Which is why I often reference like the very first kind of like data stack for most companies is like a replicant database. Like a lot of companies, that's where it starts. It's just like, I replicated the database so we don't break it. And then I stuck some basic queries on top of it and I can count things. And that's honestly totally fine if you're just getting started. It's like, why make your life more complicated? Why get like 30 other layers involved when you just have, a couple of basic questions you need to answer. Your investors really only care about, or board only care about, how many users you have, what are your sales, very, very baseline numbers. It's not until you like hit growth that you're really like, okay, we need now to deep dive and segment and do all these very specific activities that often take more complex, SQL queries and things like that. Nice.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Let's see. So someone did ask like the tech stack, but I think I only have one question, which is more around like, what are your business goals? I mean, I don't know if you can reference your business goals at your current company, but like maybe what were some business goals that you had at Smartsheet, maybe early on that you were kind of working to align towards?
Yeah, this is an example of figuring out what's the important part. Like, what are people looking at for this particular analyst role is really kind of the strategy I take to a role. So I'm figuring out right now, like, right, like what are the like where do we need data the most? Is this kind of a key question now? So it's harder for me to answer where I'm at now as I'm actively hunting that down and clarifying it. So I will speak from when I joined Smartsheet about 5 years ago, I was the second sales analyst. So I was on the sales analyst team, and a lot of the goals there was where they were trying to create scale and rigor around the sales team. So sales is a unique spot for data. Usually, as I'm talking to data people, they're in product or marketing, finance, somewhere like that. But for sales, I learned a lot about the world rapidly. So they were trying to go from a world where you have a bunch of sales reps, they need to sell into these accounts, but you need to make sure it's pretty fair. Like every rep has kind of a fair shot at hitting their quota. So one of the business goals I hit, almost immediately, I didn't know what I was getting into, frankly, when I did it, was essentially mapping out like what should our sales headcount be? Like how big should our sales team be? How many accounts should we give them? What kind of quota would that roll into? Like these questions around like, how do we scale this team so they're successful and we can hire the people we need the next year? Like, do we have the accounts for it? How do we structure it for everybody? So really kind of the business goal was scale the sales team to be, world-class and have the resources they needed. And thus us have confidence bringing a number to the head of sales and to the board that like, we're going to take this quote on and we think we can hit it next year. So that was a big piece was as I joined that team, was talking with the director who really had deep knowledge. He'd already been at Smartsheet for several years, and talking with different sales leaders and getting some rapport with them so I could start building out the data they needed. So a lot of the business goals were around building a sales team. And that's a unique set of data. It's not telemetry in the app. It's not, marketing spend is a bit of it. It kind of feeds into some bits of it, but very different to be structuring like, how should our sales team look? How do you give accounts fairly? There's different, sales teams, that kind of thing. So a lot of business goals around that. It was a very interesting problem to go and tackle. And the only piece I'll emphasize is this is it was very important for me to develop relationships. Like that was the biggest, especially as a data worker. And this isn't just on a sales team. I've learned this as I worked with various other teams later on at Smartsheet, is relationship development was the key piece to accomplish whatever the business goal is. It was about relationships. Going out, whether it's going to those happy hours or going into the office when people are there. It was all about being at their team meetings, things like that. So just building that rapport with people, especially leaders who could affect change. That was a big piece of it. To make sure your stakeholders know who you are and that they're happy with what you're doing and they know what you're doing. So that was a big piece, no matter what the business goals are on the sales side or whatever else. Relationship building is the tack I would take to make sure I got, could actually impact whatever the goal was.
Yeah, I think you said a few things that are definitely interesting to me. One, well, you didn't say this, but like sales, I think is an interesting place to be in from an analytics standpoint because people really care if you're accurate, right? Like you said, like you better get their sales numbers right because they know their sales number. Every one of them is very aware of who they sold to for that quarter, and they're very aware if you miss it. So I'm sure you probably had plenty of conversations where like, I'm missing this one account that I know I sold. I don't know if that's true, but I imagine that's a very likely possibility.
Oh, down to the dollar. Yeah. When it has to do with commission checks, things like that. Yeah, for sure. You better know your data because they know it.
Yeah. So there was that. And I think the other thing was knowing who to talk to get things done, because that stood out because I think most of the time, again, as like technical people, we focus on getting things done on the technical layer, which is a lot more like, whatever, A to B, getting data from point A to point B. But after that, it's like, okay, but actually driving change and actually driving value means people need to get involved. And that's always like the harder part, right? It's like, okay, now who do I talk to now that I know this information to make something happen, right? Like, because if you tell it to one person, nothing's going to happen, right? Like either they don't have the power or they don't care. So figuring out who cares about this information and do they have the power to make a change is always kind of important. And do you have any recommendations how people like figure out who they should talk to, I guess, in that process?
Yeah. So this is interesting. Sometimes you initially kind of gravitate towards the biggest title you can find that'll listen to it, who kind of understands data. So that's always nice, right? Is you have, someone, a VP. In my case, I found a VP who spoke operations and data, which is really nice, who could help. Quickly became the person I would go to make sure that I was on the right path. I would, in the middle of analysis, just get his thoughts on it to make sure I was in the right place. I think the other part, though, is as you're at an org, you start understanding, especially people who've been there for a while, like who have undue influence for their role. Like someone who's in a role where you're like, you have a lot of influence over what happens just off of being really likable, or you really like, they have really good ideas, but they don't want to move beyond their current role. Like whatever it is, you kind of recognize the people who are in the room a lot or influence decisions seem to go through them informally. So that's the other piece, is pick up on who are the informal kind of people with influence and make sure that you're staying informed with them and pass your data ideas through them. I think that's a critical filter, because they'll kind of synthesize the rest of the team for you. You don't need to go to 50 people. You can go to a couple people who everyone goes through anyway and get kind of a lay of the land. So that's my other piece of advice, is don't just look for big titles. There's people who are influential that you kind of need to seek out and find in the org.
Yeah, you just kind of you referenced Ben earlier, but Ben Stansel, I think he referenced that term a lot, like in the room. So for anyone who's wondering, that's generally the people who are in the conversations that are happening that no one else is in the room about. The more serious conversations that in public, they're like, we're doing great. In the room, they're like, we have 5 weeks.
Yeah, exactly.
We need to figure things out tomorrow. And Nate has this great idea and knows this great opportunity, and we're going to now test it out. So,
good luck, Nate. We'll see if in 5 weeks it works. Yeah, exactly.
Or you're fired. No, I'm kidding. Let's see. So, just more of a question for startups. For startups, which needs faster deliverables? What are your recommendations? Allocating time percentage among data visualizations, engineering, machine learning, validation, etc.
Yeah, this is a good question, because that's where I'm at now. Is I'm a month in and haven't delivered right a thing yet, because I've gotten context. So it's funny. I feel this pressure like every day. It's a little bit more like, okay, like time to deliver something. So yeah, this is a great question. I'll say, at least at first, the machine learning part, I think that's not needed essentially at all. That in terms of initial deliverables or faster deliverables when reports or dashboards are needed. So would focus less on that and more on, what do I need to do to count things? Like this is where I'm like literally today, like I'm in the database, like I need to count dollars and people and like active users, like just the pretty standard like SaaS metrics. Like how do I get to those numbers? So I would allocate time based on those needs, on where the most time is needed. So like for me, I might actually need to do some more engineering. Like I'm building DBT models to like get stuff into shape. Like I need to get data sources together to count like active users, because there's the product data where they are, and then there's like who are the users or somewhere else, right? So my time right now is spent a little more on engineering as I get like the basic facts built. But then after that, you should be spending as much as your time. Once you have the foundation there, then you can get deliverables going pretty quickly, so get the flywheel going. So I bet it weights heavier towards the engineering piece of things at the start, getting data into the shape it needs to be. And then after that, you can really get the flywheel going around who's, like let's make this into a data viz of some kind, or a table, or whatever it is. You can do that a little quicker, but I'd wager it's engineering heavy first, and later on, then it's like get analysis out or get a dashboard out to folks, counting those kind of basic numbers, and things will grow from there. I think we all know, once you submit a dashboard, that it never is static, that it will forever be growing. So that's just part of it, is get something out there and get it tested, and your dashboard will be able to, you'll be able to build more over the time. It's rarely a one and done releasing something like that.
Yeah. Oh, what is this? I guess, did Sophie used to work with you?
Oh, she joined Smartsheet. I actually moved to the BI team this summer. She joined sales ops. So funny enough, I helped interview. So hey, Soph, and thanks for joining. It's really great to hear from you. Yeah, we crossed paths a little bit at Smartsheet there.
Nice. Yeah, the data world truly is big and small all at once, is how I often find it. It's like, at first you're like, wow, it's so big, and then you start running into everyone, and you're like, no, everyone knows everyone in this space, which is good and bad. Of course, then someone's like,
the accusations have started. Love it.
I mean, there's so many weird coincidences that I'm going to be part of a few of them in shortly enough, and I'm just like, oh man, people are going to think these some things were planned, and it's just like sometimes it's just that way.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I guess I'm curious, like when you build like dashboards and reporting, do you usually maybe initially just give some people some numbers first, and then kind of maybe build that into a dashboard, or how do you kind of go about that in like a process kind of standpoint?
Yeah, process for building one. So I typically will wireframe something first before going out and building it. Like this is from like lessons learned of spending way too much time trying to like perfect a Tableau dashboard. And then you show it to someone and they're like, this is not what I wanted, rebuild it. Like, and you spend all the time getting everything pixel perfect and like the fonts like line up, don't wrap, that kind of thing. So a lot of it is for me is wireframing it first, like saying literally on a whiteboard or like in a PowerPoint, like a Google slide, just like drawing boxes saying, here's what's going to go where. Found that to be immensely helpful when designing a visualization heavy dashboard. And then from there, then you can start filling it in. And for me, it's a lot of iteration. Like every week or two, I'd set up a meeting with the stakeholder and say, here's what I have per week. Like, is this what you want? Like, are we on the right track or not? So a lot of it is iterating with the stakeholders is really what I am. I've seen, there's one analyst that I worked with at Smartsheet who spent all this time, like just an immense, like 50 hours, 60 hours a week for several straight weeks building out a dashboard and showed it to the stakeholders, and stakeholders were like, this is not what I asked for, man. Like this, like go throw it away. Like this, I don't want to use this. So I remember that being really like tough for him. It was his first data job. He's like, oh, like what did I just do? Like what happened? So a lot of iterating to make sure you're not going to a black hole and go from there. After that, I'm not the artist. So for me, it's just making something functionally like okay looking. I'm married to an artist who has an art degree from university, so I let her, like she has all the art skills. So for me, visualization is usually more pragmatic. Wish I was, more gifted at that, but I kind of know my limitations. So I make something very pragmatic and kind of let that roll out from there.
Yeah, usually my setup for most dashboards is 3 metrics on the top, 2 like more detailed dashboards, and then like something at the bottom that's even more detailed. And if they want to do clickable, we can talk about that afterwards. It's like, okay, you want to drill down into more things afterwards and have like Tableau actions. Okay, let's talk about what that looks like. But let's start here, and then and I'll make it look nice and good enough. But
yeah, mine's usually very similar. Like start at the top level stuff and kind of move down in grain. Exactly like we would have like a report with the accounts with like the high level metrics. Then the list of the accounts. If you clicked on the account, you get the list of users. So we kind of let the dashboard flow down, top to bottom, detail wise. So totally, that's one of the strategies. I'm a big believer in just providing people the data and letting them pivot it as they need to. Like that's a lot of what I was doing was getting these tables we built in Snowflake, and that source of truth was let people just go pivot it. Like they have their own tools. Like they like using Excel or like Tableau. It doesn't really matter. Let me give you the data with some good guardrails so you can go pivot it safely. Like that was at Funko, actually, to harken back to the earlier part of our conversation. That was one of the first pieces that I worked on was building out some source of truth tables for like the products, that we had and who's buying them and what are the orders, and letting the sales leadership team and others just pivot it, like put it in Excel and let them go into the table and look at top items by customer by week. And it was there, right? So that a lot of it too is just giving people data, letting them pivot it is another strategy to relieve some of the pressure to show data to folks.
Yeah, and it feels like when I first started in the whole like as a BI kind of role, I would build a Tableau dashboard, and I swear like half the times people would just be like, "Can I just download this into Excel?" And you just be like, I mean, I put all this work, so you didn't have to do that, but apparently you want to do something else with it. What numbers aren't you seeing that I am giving you? So.
Yeah, it's like a meme at this point for all of us. But yeah, it's what happens. And so I've learned from that to just have the data be available. Like I worked with a team once where one of the teams was using Tableau just as a CSV exporter. Like that's the only way they could get the data they needed to like do all these pivots. And so I replaced that. I was like, can I just build you a table in like the database? You just connect to it in Excel. So some people were using it. Funny enough, they thought that's what they had to do, but there's better ways to do it. But it's really common. Like people want the data. So you have to be kind of mindful of that as an analyst, I think.
Yeah, I think I just tweeted that like, most of us want to live in this perfect data reality that doesn't exist. The reality is most of the time someone's probably making a decision off of an Excel report that never even maybe went through your whole data warehouse. And then you're like, why did
Right.
I build this data warehouse? Because
You're like,
someone's just getting some direct data export and then slicing and dicing it and getting these numbers. So
I always find that as a chance. I consider that an opportunity to build a new, like usually that person doesn't like that they had to waste time finding the data on their own. So I try to get a new ally that way. Actually, I say, okay, who are you? Like, I did this all. Smartsheet grew so fast. It was, much bigger when I left than when I started. So I'd find those kind of folks doing shadow analytics, and so trying to get them into the fold, saying, let me make life easier for you, like kind of give them the carrot. So yeah, exactly. That finding those people was a big piece of the day too.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I've definitely seen plenty of shadow IT and shadow analytics out there.
Yeah.
Let's see. I don't know if there's a direct answer for this, but how many dashboard modules are too many? I don't know if there's a good answer.
I don't have a good one. I just don't want it to look like a cockpit, I guess. Like as long, I don't know. Probably something like 6 or so. If there was like actually like throw a number out, like it feels like something like that works pretty well for how many it should be. But for me, it's like it's kind of a feel, really, right? Like sometimes, like if you can have really big charts, you can only have a couple pieces with it that have like good tool tips, right? So probably depends on the use case, but you don't want anything. The more metrics you put in there, the less people will get out of the dashboard. Really, is kind of how I look at it.
I'm posting an article, but I like this one article. Yeah. It's in UX Planet. It's like 10 rules for better dashboards. And I think I've always found that that's kind of a helpful guide for most people for trying to figure out like, what should my dashboard look like? How many modules should it have? Like, what's the layout? Things like that. So I just posted that in there. Let's see. For you, what is the best data viz tool and why?
For me, so part of it, by the way, is like trying to figure it out for the company. That's part of it. I mean, for me, I've used Tableau since 2014, really. Yeah. So for me, like the easiest one for me to run is Tableau because that's what I'm used to. But by the way, this is a question I'm actively figuring out. I was like, is that the right one now at where I'm at? Because it's a bigger tool. I know that it can get kind of expensive, like it certainly was at the last couple places I've been. So is it the right tool now for what I'm trying to do, especially with the desire to, export data out of it? Storytelling in Tableau can be a challenge. Like a lot of times you're just giving someone a dashboard. It's really hard to like get them a story in it. So I'm investigating some other options around like is Tableau the one I need to do? I'm not there yet. I haven't really actively been looking at it. But that's a question in my mind it's the best for me because I can do it the fastest, but is it the right one? Actually, it's been 8 years. Maybe there's something else that I can be looking at. So it's actually on my mind. It's a good question. I'd also love to know the answer to. I'm trying to figure it out.
Yeah. I feel like Tableau has had really good staying power for I think it started either 2003, 2008, and it's had amazing staying power. It does everything really well in terms of it's pretty easy to get started. Power BI, I don't know. I wish the visuals were different. I think it's the one feeling I always get. It's like, it just feels like Excel charts, but in a dashboard. Looker is always hit or miss. One, if you're talking about expensive, I think Looker's starting price, like just to sign the contract, is like $30,000. If you get them to discount the like $50,000 signing cost, so that's expensive, and it can be difficult to set up if you're unfamiliar. Sigma, I know, is kind of like the new kid on the block that's trying to kind of do almost like Power Query in the cloud plus like some dashboarding. And of course, there's plenty of others, but yeah, I feel like Tableau is always like a solid bet, and I'm surprised how long it's like withstood that. Like I'm always like, wow, it's been here a long time. We're still using it. So
I don't like people know it. Like when I hopped into Insightly, like people know it already. So it's another piece. Like people just know Tableau, like they've used it somewhere. So I think that helps the staying power. Is there's not a dashboard that's an order of magnitude better, like dashboard tool order than Tableau. There might be ones that are marginally better, but usually if it's already there, you might as well use it. But there's nothing there like right now, then there's options. But usually like it's like they're an entrenched, so there's really no reason to move away from it. And that kind of gives it that staying power. It's still great. Like did some great things with it.
Yeah. The one thing I dislike is that its online component does not save automatically, which I'm still just baffled by. I'm just like, how does this not save automatically?
Really? So I've never used the online version. I didn't know that.
Yeah. I've had multiple times where I've like done like 30 minutes of work and like it'll just crash. And then like it'll be like, and you're starting all over again. You're just like, are you kidding me? What year is this that you don't save my work automatically? Like I thought this would be a thing. You just, Google Sheets has that version control thing. You can't do that at
Yeah.
all. You're just XML underneath the hood, like, so.
I just expect anything cloud-wise to just save every click I do, basically. It's just like an expectation in the cloud. That's interesting.
That is my expectation. Maybe I didn't see a feature, like maybe there's something I need to click that saves automatically, but I know it does not do that out of the box. It was just like I was very much like floored when I like had it reset and then be back 30 minutes behind. I was like,
hit that save button every like 5 minutes. Then okay, great.
Yeah, it's like Photoshop 1995. Apple S.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, I think we're pretty much out of questions. I don't know, and also it's like 8:15. I don't want to keep you here forever. Any final thoughts? Any questions before we kind of sign off?
No, I'm good. I'm thanks for having me on. This has been a great discussion around data. As you mentioned, the world's small, so I'm sure we'll all keep talking, and we see each other on Twitter. It's just such a great data community. So happy to be part of it, and thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Nate, and I will see you later.
Yeah, see you later. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. We'll hit end broadcast.